Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre. My name's Sally Warhaft, and it's just a tremendous pleasure tonight to be, getting into a chat with these two distinguished women about what's going on in our national capital and beyond. Laura Tingle is the political editor of the Australian Financial Review and the author of the quarterly essay Great Expectations, Government, Entitlement and an Angry Nation. And she's also working on, I think it's the next quarterly essay.
Out on the 23rd of November.
There we are, out on the... and it's
just
titled...
in time for Christmas.
Is it Political Amnesia?
Political Amnesia, How We Forgot How to Govern.
Fantastic. We will remember to read it, yes. Laura has won, amongst her many, achievements and awards, 2 Walkleys, the Paul Lynham Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism, and she'll be known to many of you as a regular on L&L as well. Michelle Grattan has been a member of the Canberra Press Gallery for 40 plus years.
Round then.
She must have
Round that.
She must have started as a child. She worked for Fairfax for many years, including as political editor of The Age, and she's currently a professorial fellow at the University of Canberra and the chief political correspondent for The Conversation, which she's been doing for almost 3 years. And please look out in the coming next couple of months before Christmas for The Conversation's 2015 yearbook, which is called Politics, Policy and the Chance for Change. And have a look at the Conversation website. If you don't regularly already, it'll tell you how to get it. Otherwise, go and ask your local bookshop to get it in time for Christmas. Michelle received an Order of Australia in 2004 and the Walkley Award for Journalism Leadership in 2006. A Walkley Awards ceremony that I was there at. Were you there, Laura, when... was it Glenn Milne punched Stephen Mayne and you could still smoke, and it was like my fantasy. It was the first Walkleys I ever went to, and Michelle got the big gong and she wore a magnificent dress and gave a very memorable speech, and it was just a wonderful night for me, Michelle, so I hope it was for you as well. Please give them another warm welcome. I want to start tonight by asking each of you a little bit about Turnbull the person, and to start with the question, how good is he?
Thanks, Michelle. Well, how good is he at what? Now, what do we know about him? He's exceptionally smart. He can be exceptionally charming and persuasive. And he can also be really horrible. And I don't think we, in the current love-a-thon we're having, we should forget that. He's still probably the scariest person you could ever have at the end of an irate phone call.
Except Paul Keating.
Oh, I don't know. I think he gives him a bit of a run for his money, Michelle. And Malcolm does this thing where... he sort of sizes you up, usually not very favourably. I mean, a lot of this is sort of, we're not seeing a lot of this at the moment, but he sizes you up, you can sort of see it happening, I think, can't you? It's just like, and he decides whether you're smart, whether you're useful to him, and all those sorts of things. And you can be having a conversation and then you lose him to his mobile phone, and which is a bit humiliating, let's face it. You think, well, I'm obviously not very intelligent or interesting. Look, he's the big question with Malcolm Turnbull is, we saw as opposition leader one side of his personality, this incapacity to tolerate fools, to talk to anybody else because Malcolm always knows best. All of that seems to have been sort of hidden away for the time being, and he is capable of great things, I think, and he obviously has galvanised people's opinions, but we don't know, the other Malcolm is still lurking there somewhere. And I know of a couple of people who've got the wrong end of his tongue just in the last few weeks. And so it's still there. And that's something we're just going to have to watch.
I think he's very good at sketching out the big picture, very good at identifying coming issues. His theme at the moment, of course, as you know, is innovation, and he has all this inspirational language around it. He keeps saying this is a wonderful time to be alive, it's a wonderful time to be an Australian. And going with that vision thing, if you like, he is also a very good communicator. He's got good phrases, he can pick up themes, and he can resonate with people. Now, I think one of the questions is, how good is he translating the big ideas into policies that work, that fit together, that can be delivered? He's, of course, just been Communications Minister, and he might have inherited all sorts of problems with the NBN, but even under his watch, costs blew out, problems arose. So at a ministerial level, we saw problems. When he was opposition leader, again, he had great difficulties, and I think that period showed that while he can communicate at a general level, he doesn't communicate, or didn't then, all that well with colleagues. He wasn't a very good manager of people at all. Laura's illustration about him talking to you and then going off onto the mobile phone points to this bigger problem, that he doesn't tolerate fools well. He finds it, and he defines the fools fairly, he's got a fairly wide world there, and he finds it hard over a sustained period to manage people. And I think the big question is whether he's turned into a genuinely better manager of people. He came in talking about cabinet government as the centre of everything. Now, cabinet government is all about being collegial, listening, taking collective decisions and so on. And we have to see over the medium and longer term whether he can live up to the ideal of cabinet government, and at a wider level the better management of people than he displayed earlier.
I feel like we could have just been listening to a Rudd the second. If I'd asked you that question about Kevin Rudd with the comeback.
There are similarities. There are a lot of similarities.
Is Turnbull kind of weird?
What are you saying about Kevin Rudd there, Sally? Look, I don't think he is weird. But there are a lot of similarities.
It really
with
rings
the
of
Kevin Rudd things. Yeah. But I mean, I think that one of the crucial things about what's going to happen next goes in some ways to the Rudd experience. We're talking about cabinet government, but everybody keeps going back to talking about Malcolm Turnbull. You know, we're all doing it here. I think one of the really interesting things that's happened, if you look at the last 8 years, was we get these situations and these relationships that are born in opposition. Kevin, and if you can allow me to just go back to Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd came in as opposition leader with only a short time to go before the election campaign. And I mean, this has always tended to happen in the past, but he ran this unbelievably tight campaign. Everybody in the Labor Party was so desperate to get back. They basically deferred to him, you know, captain's calls, as we now sort of fashionably call them. Basically, everything was given deference to the leader. And I remember sitting in the Fairfax boardroom one day with the old gang of four, Kevin Rudd, Wayne Swan, Julie Gillard and Lindsay Tanner, and being quite shocked. This is about 6 months before the 2007 election, with the three of them just sitting there, you know, waiting to be asked a question by Kevin. Now, I think what happened was he then gets into government, or they get into government, but the relationships had been established. And you'd get cabinet ministers in that government saying, oh, you don't know what it's like, he might be really mean and sack me. And I'm going, oh, for God's sake, you're in the Constitution, I don't think he is. And so that habit was there. And the same thing was true of Tony Abbott. They basically gave him free rein in opposition. He was there for a very long time with that tight little group of people. He couldn't make that transition. Now, I think Labor ministers didn't learn the lesson and sort of say, look, bugger off Kevin, or even bugger off Julia to some extent. We are here as well, we want an argument. I think the interesting dynamic, or the really important dynamic, is that I think the coalition ministers have realised that, and they're sort of on their watch. They're all very excited that Malcolm's doing very well, but one, they've had an experience with him which wasn't very pleasant beforehand, and I think those really crucial brawls that they had over the last few months, particularly on citizenship, where Tony Abbott just pushed them just way too far, has made them go, no, we actually have to assert ourselves in quite a formal and official and repeated way against the whims of a leader. And I think that's going to be a very important dynamic.
There seems to me just a great sense of relief about Tony Abbott being gone. I know it's not universal, but it feels pretty broad. And as Keating, as Paul Keating said last week in Melbourne, I think in Sydney as well, that the bar was so low, all anyone had to do was step over it, except he did this great thing with his foot. And I wonder, though, what the mood in Canberra is like, in the press gallery. Is there a relief there? Because, I've heard more policy discussion in the last 6 weeks than I think in a couple of years.
I think there definitely is a sense of relief there that this administration, from the point of view of most journalists, is much easier to deal with. It's more back to a routine professional dealing. That's not to say that there won't be moments of tension and so on, but the control mentality of the Abbott regime was really extraordinary, and almost all things that were given out were pre-released, mainly through the Daily Telegraph, but then also in some high-end stuff through the Australian, and of course there was this whole pursuit and persecution of the ABC, which was just crazy. In the end, the obsession with Q&A was just amazing. And so at that level, and things also were not released, events were not released, the details of them, till 2.5 minutes before they happened. So just doing ordinary things became very difficult. But with the wider community, I think it is quite extraordinary, this sense of relief. I don't remember that same feeling in any previous time quite in this way, frankly. And people just found the divisiveness of the Abbott government, the constant high level of attack, the general nasty tone that politics had taken on. And of course that followed what had gone before in the Labor years, and things had got particularly nasty. But I think what you had was a very cynical electorate who then found themselves bombarded with this really aggressive, aggro variety of politics, and that's been wound back. Clearly Turnbull's attitude, his way of doing things is a more consensus way. Now, again, that won't last forever, and we're heading to an election campaign, and of course that's all about difference and division. But the thing was that under the Abbott administration, everything was about division, where now there's a much more selective approach. Can I just go back to the question about Rudd for 2 seconds? I think the thing that they share is their absolutely massive egos and a belief that they really do know the answers. There's not a lot of self-doubt in either of those men.
Yeah. And it wasn't just aggro, also I think with the Abbott regime by the end. I think it was the absolute inanity of it, the absolute ridiculousness of the positions that the government was taking. Tax, I work for the Fin Review, so I'd say that, but the tax debate had just got stupid. Everybody knows...
Well, Joe Hockey actually admitted it, didn't he, last week?
Yeah, everybody knows that something has to give on tax for a variety of reasons, and the government was running around saying, oh, we don't have to do any of this. It was just... people just going, oh, come on, give us a break.
Mind you, now you've got this situation where everyone... every time anyone says anything, it's on the table, that you have this laden table with everything on it, and someone at some stage has got to take some stuff off that table, and then the real debate will begin.
Who do you think Turnbull is channeling? Is it sort of a Howard, brought in the GST, convinced an electorate about it, as I think Turnbull may well do with GST, actually, or superannuation, or a hawk, the consensus, the idea we're going to... Who do you think he's modelling his prime ministerial self on?
Well, I would have thought Malcolm wouldn't actually ever deign to admit that he was modelling himself on anybody.
We're back to Rudd again, aren't we?
No, look, there are definite whiffs of both John Howard and Bob Hawke in the way Malcolm Turnbull's going about things. In some ways, I think more Hawke than Howard. One of the things I write about in this essay, which I won't go on about, but it's about. I think there are dangers in trying to sort of just, say, oh, well, he's doing the Hawke thing or he's doing the Howard thing. I think times have changed a bit. And I think the thing that's exciting about Malcolm Turnbull is he's really, attuned to that change. He's attuned to the change in the economy. He's really grasped that, demand and desire for a change in the politics as well. So it will be something a bit different because all the mechanisms of those earlier prime ministerships have changed, if you think about it. The institutions. There are some journalistic colleagues who still yearn for the good old days of the tripartite agreements and the Accord and peak body politics. It doesn't work like that anymore. So you have to play it differently. It's more complicated. So I think he's picking up bits of both of those things, but I think Malcolm Turnbull would see what he's doing as something completely new.
I think it's interesting, he does talk a lot about Howard, and he has brought back some Howard people in all sorts of roles, and yet, one reason why he goes back to those days, I think, is that Howard has achieved a sort of godlike status now, and his government is seen as successful and smooth and so on. Now, I have to say it wasn't like that at the time, but that's how the Liberals now nostalgically look back on it, and I think that Turnbull's sort of tapping into that as one element of going back to Howard. And yet it does seem to me that those two are just so very different. Howard was the quintessential ordinary man, ordinary person who translated those ordinary qualities into a very successful prime ministership, even though he lost in the end. Whereas Turnbull really is literally quite an extraordinary character in terms of his background what he did before he got into politics, the way he just sort of smashed his way into politics and to the Prime Ministership, whereas Howard, of course, had a much more conventional background, entry to politics and climb up the political ladder. So they are very, very different, even though there is this reference point for Turnbull.
I feel like he's the first Prime Minister in my time, at least, where you know, there isn't this sort of the myth of, or the narrative of my hard battling life. You know, my mother died, or this happened, or we had no money for.
Well, there's a bit of that.
Yes,
though.
he has gone back to that.
But do you think he's gone back to it? I feel like he's
Not
gone
recently,
more
but
the other
earlier.
way since he's been Prime Minister. That it's been a change from his time in opposition, where he did do it, to the Prime Ministership, where he's just saying, "I am filthy rich. I'm not like any of you."
No, I don't think that's quite right. I mean, the point is, Malcolm Turnbull has come to the Prime Ministership as, I think, a pretty well-known quantity from that earlier period. And I think he would presume that people remember his story about the single dad and all of the sort of sadness of his early life. And I don't think he was coming in saying, I am filthy rich by, complete design, but Labor sort of basically, bowled a full toss at him and he said, thank you, I'll have that one. So I think it's a little bit different, but it is certainly true that it is a real transformation in politics, isn't it, that somebody can just say, yeah, I'm really rich, hey, what about it? And more so that
I'll
voters
help make you rich too.
Yeah, and voters say, yeah, he's rich, so what? They may be worried about tax havens at the edges, which is what Labor's pinning its hopes on, but, people in general, their response has been, so what? Good on him.
One of the things in Australian politics, it seems to me, is that if you want to reform in any area of policy, you have to seize it. It's pretty hard to step around the edges. If you want to change something, you get in there, you explain what you want to do, you come up with a policy, and you do it. Now, there are these key areas, of course, of difficulty awaiting Malcolm Turnbull, and we all know the areas, particularly climate change, marriage equality. How will he be able to reform in these areas that he cares so much about? Republic, I mean, we know where he stands on these. How do you seize reform when you've got this rump of a part of your party that wants you gone? And Tony Abbott's still there. I mean, I keep having to remind myself, he's still there. How do you do that?
Well, I think in general, to achieve reform, you need to know what you're going to want to do. You need to know what is feasible. In other words, not bite off a whole lot, get some of those things off the table and decide what you want to keep on the table. But you've also got to win the trust of the people. And we've had a recent interesting example of this, where in New South Wales we had Mike Baird re-elected, even though people didn't like the central reform plank of his election policy, that was electricity privatisation. But they were willing to buy it because they had enough faith in him to say, well, he is the better of the choices available, and we do trust him enough on this issue that we'll swallow the downsides of it. So I think those things are really important, of trust and judgment, and then political courage to go after it, as you're saying. Malcolm Turnbull does have some complications in this area which are not so obvious in this honeymoon period, but are there. If you take marriage equality, for example, he's had to accept the Abbott plebiscite, even though he had a whole lot of objections to it at the time. He may try to bring on a legislation ahead of the election, which would be seen by many of the party as a bit tricky, and that legislation would then trigger the enactment of same-sex marriage after the plebiscite. But he's been forced into a position which he didn't agree with, which he publicly opposed indeed, and that raises all sorts of questions of consistency and so on. And he was forced into that position because he was trying to get votes for the leadership. And it's the same thing on climate change, where he had to accept that he wouldn't change the existing coalition policy. The Nats, for example, so distrusted him that they insisted on this being put in writing with a number of other policy matters. So again, he might get round that at the edges, but on a couple of key issues, he is in a different position than the one he actually believes in. And when you're reforming, those inconsistencies can throw doubt in a wider context.
I mean, and timing is everything. And just sitting here while we're thinking about this, if you think about what's happened, he's got these issues where he's locked in. Everybody knows he's locked into positions he doesn't like. Now, how will he change those? He will change those when there's an opportunity because of events, or because his authority within the government becomes such that he can force through a change within the government, just like trying to get a reform through the broader community. So what's Malcolm Turnbull's strategy? So we're all being innovative and agile and exciting and excited, and he announced the chief scientist's appointment today, and we all went down to the press conference and we were more excited and more innovative. And it was actually quite a funny press conference because the Prime Minister took over the questions of the chief scientist.
Who looked a bit shocked, actually, yes, because the questioning was quite hard.
Yeah, it was. It was all a bit strange. But we've got that discussion going on about innovation, which is something a bit interesting, but a bit sort of nebulous, really. But if you think about it, it has recast all the dreary old debates, which we all sort of know are sort of sitting there as well, like the budget, which have been so dominant for the last 20 or 30 years, but while we're all sort of looking at the bright, shiny new innovation debate, we're not really all that sort of conscious of the fact that he's just got, in a financial sense, a series of nightmares to solve, along with social issues like same-sex marriage. What are they going to do about the higher education package? What are they going to do about health funding? All those cuts to the states.
Keep putting it on the table.
Yeah, they're on the table. But they're put off for the moment. If he can build up his credibility and deliver something on innovation where everybody goes, oh, gee, that's good, that just it wins him some time to do a bit of manoeuvring behind the scenes, hopefully, builds up his authority and credibility within the government, and then he just slices off some of these issues one by one.
But he has made himself a bit of a hostage to fortune on this innovation thing, because he's promising a statement before Christmas, and today at this press conference, Christopher Pyne was again talking up how big all this was going to be, and someone rather inconveniently said, well, didn't we have an innovation-like statement a year ago? And anyway, that was just building blocks, wasn't it, that statement? Yes. And now we're presumably going to have the whole house. But of course, if this innovation statement does not live up to expectations, if the Financial Review says, well, this is a bit of a crock,
which is probably fairly likely, even for
then you do find that there's more scepticism about, and a more critical approach will come on other things as well.
Tony Abbott tried to convince us as Australians that we had to reconceive what we expect of government, and that it obviously didn't go very well for him. But I'm wondering what Malcolm Turnbull is saying about what we should expect from government. It's a key question. It's a key question in your first quarterly essay. About entitlement, about expectations, about Australians not really understanding what the relationship is with government even anymore. Is there any light or any certainty about what Turnbull's sense of that relationship, what he's trying to get across, other than nicer and innovative?
Look,
agile too.
Agile.
Very agile.
Yes.
He's got to be very agile at the moment.
Yeah.
Look, I think he's managed to he's still in this sort of wonderful stage of having the best of both worlds. Like, for example, Greg Hunt, the Environment Minister, goes around saying, we've brought the Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation back into the department so they can work better together. And he was saying this at a function I was at a couple of weeks ago, and I put my hand up and said, can I just clarify that those two things are still up for abolition? You know, you've got the legislation in the Senate. Oh, well, yes, but we can't get it through the Senate. So in the meantime, there's a lot of that in, I think, the Malcolm position. But when he did a whole series of newspaper interviews on Friday, I asked him about Gonski. Remember Gonski? And not about the Gonski package as put down by Labor, but about the idea of trying to establish some very sophisticated funding base which addressed the needs of individual students. And he was basically very supportive of that idea, but said it's just administratively, we just can't do it yet. So I think this reflects his general view that we should be able to put a lot of resources into education. I think that's part of his world view, but he's still, and I think he's also got a very interesting view of the role of government, and you can see that in some speeches he gave as Communications Minister, where he said, reflecting on the NBN, where, as Michelle says, it's turned out it wasn't quite so easy as he thought, but his basic position is a completely pragmatic one, which is, look, government actually does do some things very well, which is something you don't really hear very much of in Canberra. And he said, you've got to just say who is the best person to do a particular job, and then how do you make it work best together. Now, I don't know if that entirely answers the question, but I think it's not an ideological position, it's a position of pragmatism, and he talks about pragmatism a lot. And I think you just notice it when he's talking about energy. He says, look, there are all these different energy options, nuclear, renewables, whatever. We've got to look at what the best low-cost option is and balance all these very conflicting and contradictory other issues. So I think it's just basically a pragmatic view, but one that isn't built on the idea that government is bad.
Yes, I don't think it's easy to get any feel of a broader theory of the role of government from him. Even if you looked at the raft of interviews he did at the weekend, it was interesting that if you had to write an essay on the basis of them, what does Malcolm Turnbull believe? I think it would be quite hard to do. He does stress that we shouldn't take an ideological approach to things, but in terms of his own philosophy about government, it really isn't spelled out that I know of.
What about as a nationalist? Does he have do you have a sense of a sort of a national project for Australia, or again is that hard to read? I'm trying to think of, you don't hear that rhetoric from him very often. The idea of I suppose we heard it from much more from Howard, Rudd, Gillard, real, whether the nationalist sort of line of, this great Australian nation and so on.
It's a bit of a relief we're not hearing it, huh?
Yeah, well,
Or is that just me?
But do you know...
Well, just going back to those interviews, he was quoting Mao apparently to the Smage, and Mao, or paraphrasing Mao, saying, we're standing up for China, and saying we're standing up for Australia. But it's not a nationalist thing. It's just more that sort of sense that in a sort of an economic sense, we can be much more dynamic, and we can be proud of being Australian. But we're sort of mercifully free of all the flags and all that sort of stuff. So
footies on the prime ministerial bookshelf.
No footies.
Yeah.
No, that sort of stuff.
Mm.
In a way, he's a sort of internationalist, isn't he, in the sense of he's being tuned into the technology of the world and cutting edge and all this stuff. That seems to preoccupy him more than the nationalist type grand schemes.
Listening to you both, he is different, isn't he? There's or certainly in recent history, we haven't had a leader like him. He certainly hasn't come in. I know it's only been 6 weeks, but he's had a lot of time to, probably all his adult life, to think about what he'll do when he becomes Prime Minister. He hasn't got in and rushed it, obviously. He's very tender steps. Is there any risk, do you think, that in 12 months, 18 months' time after an election, the gallery will be saying that this is a do-nothing government? It's not actually, everything, is still there, being debated, reshuffled, moved around, but not significant reform?
I think it's possible that could be the case, because when he gets down to really deciding what he's going to put to the electorate in terms of tax reform, which will probably be the most central thing, it will be quite a difficult judgment for him to decide how much he thinks he can sell. He's popular now, we've talked about the relief and so on, but if he puts up a package, he wants to increase the GST or broaden the GST and get a hoe into a few concessions, then people really start to think, well, how is this going to affect me? He doesn't have that sort of credit, I don't think, that I was speaking about before with Mike Baird. So he will have to be reasonably prudent, I think, in what he puts to the people. Assuming that he was re-elected, I think you would see a lot more of the real Malcolm Turnbull in a second term. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whatever that is.
I think in some ways circumstances compel him to make big calls. So I'd take it's not disagreeing with Michelle as such, but just a slightly different view of it. I mean, the thing that just keeps, in the back of my mind is the higher education changes. Now, things like that. The 2014 budget haunts Malcolm Turnbull as much as it haunted Tony Abbott, because people, the reaction to that budget was so visceral, and Malcolm Turnbull has to prove that he isn't Tony Abbott, and what's more, he has to prove that he isn't Tony Abbott while still being a complete bastard about a lot of these cuts. So he's going to have to find a way of selling a whole range of reforms, not just because they have to be done, but because people sort of know that they're out there. So between now and the election, which is essentially next year's budget, yes, he's got to do tax reform, but he has to resolve all of these unresolved issues of both policy and politics from the 2014 budget, because otherwise there will remain this scepticism about it because they are all unfinished projects. So I think that forces Malcolm Turnbull to play big on policy. And without a doubt, there'll be a lot of paint that comes off between now and the election, and as Michelle says, afterwards as well. But I think he's really going to have to make some very big calls. And I think he's got some very, very good young ministers in his cabinet. So I'm sort of almost more fascinated to see how they perform than I am to see how he goes.
A world of pain for Bill Shorten, obviously. You look at the polls today. You don't need a poll, do you? You look at this situation, and it looked to me that up until the change, Labor's strategy was just to sit back, really, and watch the Abbott government go into a sort of terminal, self-destructive. It was crazy. They didn't have to really do very much at all. But now they look old. They look all the things that Turnbull talks about, what he hasn't taken from them. A lot of that innovation idea, that nebulous innovation stuff, is actually straight from Labor. What does Labor do?
Well, I suppose I just make a couple of observations about that. My colleague Phil Curry wrote, I thought, a really interesting column on the weekend talking about the fact that while Abbott was sort of always given credit for destroying Rudd and Gillard and opposing all of this stuff in the Parliament, which made governing impossible, Shorten actually doesn't get any credit for the fact that he
survived.
Well, no, that Labor actually did oppose a lot of measures which everybody just presumed that they would roll over and die on because Abbott had got this mandate. And they've also taken some positions which at the time everybody sort of said, well, this is pretty stupid or crazy, which was, for example, insisting that they had to maintain an emissions trading scheme. Now, so it's not right to say that they just, sort of sat there and let Abbott disintegrate. His political style is not exactly inspiring, but if you actually look at what they've been doing, they have been sort of in there and amongst it. And as you say, they've had all of this policy ready to go, and they started to roll it out as soon as Turnbull appeared, and the government's stolen most of it. So it's easy to just say he's as boring as watching paint dry, but I just think it's going to be interesting to see how he responds to this. It's very hard to get over the fact that the electorate just doesn't engage with you. I don't know how you do that, but it's going to be interesting to see how Labor plays it and whether they do panic or not.
I think these days there's an interesting sort of phenomenon that it's thought that somehow no one can be allowed to lose an election. Now, this is somewhat new, I think. In earlier times, you even had opposition leaders surviving more than one term as opposition leader. But now it's, one party's changed leaders, that's changed the game. The other party's got to either change leaders or respond in some way so it's all evened up again. Well, it may be that you have to accept that sometimes you're just going to lose an election. But leaving that point aside, I do think that the union relationship, Bill Shorten and the union relationship, is a serious problem. We've obviously seen a bit of this come out in the Royal Commission, but I'm talking about that less than the fact that I think Shorten and Labor just need to be tougher on the whole union question, especially union governance. I don't know exactly why they're not letting the governance legislation through the Senate. I haven't looked at that in detail. Maybe they've got a case, but one would think that they need to somehow cut a deal and let that through. I think that they have not been tough enough on the CFMEU. Obviously, Shorten at the National Conference depended on them and some other union support when he was facing really difficult issues like the boats policy. But I really feel, the more I think about this, I really feel there is a problem there, and that one is uneasy that he is not being more robust about that problem and that constituency. Rudd obviously took it on in his time, and if you go, it's a rather different case, but if you go right back to Gough Whitlam, for example, when there were bad parts of the Labor Party, Whitlam was in opposition. Whitlam took those on, confronted them head on, and prevailed over them. And I really think that Shorten has this problem, and he needs to deal with it and show that he can deal with it.
And in dealing with it, probably define himself quite differently to the electorate, to the way they see him now.
But I don't know that he can actually deal with it.
No.
I think he should, but I don't know when it comes to the point that he would be willing to do that.
Are there, is there anyone that could obviously deal with it within the Labor Party?
Well, nobody that's shown signs of being able to deal with it. I don't know whether Bowen would be as dependent on the union base. What do you think, Laura?
No, you sort of have to really... Yeah, Bowen's probably the best, the greatest likelihood, but he is, a child of the New South Wales right, which is a slightly different thing. He's probably the one who's...
Not as much of a problem these days because it seems to have disintegrated itself.
Right, yeah.
It's under control.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you, ladies, for all your work. And Michelle, you might remember me. I attended a thing in 1978 as a schoolboy where you spoke to a class of year 11, that year 11 of politics students. One thing has the political process changed for forever now? Because there used to be a government would always get at least one term. We've seen in Victoria and Queensland both one terms of government, and it used to be. And the reason I think one of the problems Tony Abbott had, one of the many problems, was that the re-election in WA of the Senate, because he tried to appear to do the classical thing, try and blame it all on the other, that have an audit commission to say it was all their fault, and release that early in the year, but then say, look how bad it all is. This is what we have to do, and come out with a budget. So what people were saying is he didn't want to scare the horses in WA.
So the question's about whether the one-term rule still applies.
And
Michelle.
I think we're in a much more volatile period. Now, if you go back through the history since Federation, there have been volatile periods. So it's perhaps not a question of something that's entirely new, but it's certainly a pretty distinctive phase we're in. One thing that is particularly new, of course, and I think is turning quite destructive, is the whole media cycle and the media approach. And this is increasing the volatility and making it very difficult for governments to do anything that's tough and necessary. And I think that is a really new phenomenon. But in terms of particular terms of government, I think we are just in this distinctive period.
Yeah, I think that's right, Michelle. We tend to sort of go everything has changed forever and now it's different, whereas, there are cycles in this, and if you look at the early years of Federation, it was very, very volatile. So I think it is more volatile. Voters are much more prepared to say, oh, for goodness sake, you're the weakest link and off you toddle. So that does make it a bit more difficult. But if you do look at what's happened in New South Wales, I think it's sort of instructive. I mean, Barry O'Farrell came in and had this cunning plan, which was to basically not do anything for the first term and then have a reform agenda for the second term. And in some ways, Mike Bairds basically followed that, and it's sort of worked. And strangely enough, that was actually Abbott's cunning plan, and I don't know exactly what happened, except he then added on his false memory of the 1996 budget, and it all sort of went horribly wrong. But so I think it's, it is, as Michelle says, more volatile, but I don't think we should just assume that it's always going to be like that. I mean, I think you've got to look at the longer cycles of these things, and the things we tend not to talk about in a strange way are the great big economic waves. And if you look at what's just happened in Canada, the fact that whether Stephen Harper was any good or not, or whether Justin Trudeau's quite hot or not, underneath it, like Australia, Canada is a commodity economy. Suddenly it fell off the cliff. Australia's fallen off the cliff, and because the Abbott team was so in denial of the fact that the resources boom was ending because it was all Labor's fault, that's sort of hidden that from us. And inevitably, at a period when you're having this dramatic economic transformation, you're going to get a lot more volatility in politics.
Thank you. You'll be pleased to know that I have no association with anyone from the past. I'm interested in... there hasn't been any coverage to date about Malcolm's relationship with the right of his party, the very considerable right of his party. And the other sort of, if you like, dynamic that's there is that whilst, as Laura said, we've in some senses fallen off the cliff, in some senses we really haven't, in terms of as a people we haven't yet experienced the trials and tribulations of an economy really in problem. We can see it in the horizon, and I guess we're worried about it. And just trying to link this together, going back to the budget, the famous budget, the thing that I think most of us despised about that was its lack of equity. So Malcolm, in our eyes, I think, has to deliver on equity, and he has to deliver to the right, and he probably has to, by this time next year, have to deliver to a much more grim economic situation. So I just wonder what you'll make of that. Thank you.
Well, on his relations with the right, I think the right can be divided up a bit. There are some, like the right ministers that have been dropped, who remain very, very angry about what's happened and what's happened to them. And they tap into a section of the party at large, which reportedly is also unhappy about dumping a first-term Prime Minister. There are others in the right who are particularly policy-oriented, and they're watching like hawks to see what he does on issues that are key issues for them, like same-sex marriage and so on. And there's probably a third strand in the right who think, well, he's not our preferred choice, but he does look as though he's going to get more members back into the parliament. So they're pragmatic and just waiting and hoping that it all turns out for the best. In terms of delivering on these various, or to these various constituencies, the right has some particular issues that it's particularly concerned about, like climate and same-sex marriage and so on. It's into smaller government, but I don't know that it would be particularly upset about some equity issues that others in the party or the electorate in general would want him to address. Those imperatives wouldn't necessarily clash, but there would be an overall clash between, in general, trying to maintain the support of the Conservatives in the party and moving to, who was it that used to talk about the sensible centre? Was that Abbott? He never seemed to get there. Anyway, whoever talked about the sensible centre, moving to the sensible centre, obviously that's a major juggling act overall.
And I think there is this sort of split between the old economically conservative, socially progressive thing, which is the way you'd characterise Malcolm Turnbull. So the right via the Nats have really sort of got him boxed in a bit on those social issues, and they've made that their sort of their defining issue, if you like. On sort of, shall we say, the economic equity side, I don't think he's got a lot of room to manoeuvre, but we've sort of seen him trying to basically keep the budget bottom line while rearranging all the peanuts, whatever they are, walnuts, anyway, so that it is more equitable. Now, the deal that he announced last week on family tax benefits got sort of mixed reviews. A lot of people said, oh, it's much better than the previous one. A lot of people said there are still people who are missing out. But what he and Scott Morrison and Christian Porter have done is, as things have emerged, like the position of grandparents, they've come out and said, look, we're open to addressing this. We're pragmatic. We're trying to fix it. So I think there is the reality that whatever they do, they can't really tamper too much with the budget bottom line, but they will try to make it more equitable in the way things work, via, for example, being prepared to reopen the debate about superannuation tax concessions. Missing in all the current rhetoric, of course, is the debate about the surplus, which is a bit of a relief because that was not getting us anywhere. And Malcolm Turnbull sort of essentially saying, look, we've got to restrain spending until we can get revenue to grow with the economy to fund it. Now, obviously, all the pressure is on while the economy isn't growing and lifting the revenue boats. But I think he'll be dancing on that pin of trying to make the current mix more equitable, not trying to necessarily reduce the size of government, probably just trying to rearrange how it's distributed.
And of course we'll see something of his priorities in this when we get the budget update in December, because that these days has turned into a small budget statement, hasn't it, with decisions in it, so we'll see something there. Just on the Nats, I think that the relationship with the Nats will be a really interesting one potentially, because the Nats remain suspicious of Turnbull. I mentioned earlier they wanted some policy undertakings in writing. That's the first time that anybody could remember that the coalition agreement went to matters of policy. And I think that there is at least a 50-50 chance that Warren Truss will decide to retire at the election and therefore quit the leadership early in the next year. And not quit the parliament till the election, but quit the leadership. And if Barnaby Joyce takes over as leader and deputy prime minister, well, that'll be an interesting relationship.
And there's all sorts of ructions going on with the Nationals about who does take over. But I think
bet.
And I mean, Michelle would know this better than me, but the Nats sort of thought they owned Tony Abbott, or that he was their creation, that even though they didn't have a vote in 2009...
They wanted to admit that?
Well, in 2000, they don't get a vote in the leadership, obviously, but they felt that they were instrumental in bringing down Turnbull in 2009 and putting Turnbull Abbott in, and it was and Abbott kept relying on them, on things like same-sex marriage, and it sort of reminded me a little bit of the Fraser relationship with the Nats, and the Nats. Despite the fact that the party is very different from what it was in the Fraser era, the Nats were really, to use a rural analogy, sort of feeling their oats, and really felt that they, were and are in a position of much greater power than their numbers suggest.
I think they were also, though, a bit shocked and appalled about how badly it all went, and couldn't quite believe how badly it went. And they did have some differences with Abbott over policy, big differences. For example, his paid parental leave scheme, some of them would oppose publicly, and I don't think any of them liked it privately. But nevertheless, I think that the relationship with Turnbull would be potentially a much more difficult and volatile one if things started to get rough.
And just as we ending, will Abbott, do either of you know anything about what he's going to do?
No.
No?
No, and I think probably he doesn't at this stage. I think that you've got to look at it and say, well, what are his alternatives? And that becomes seriously quite difficult. There are not a lot of alternatives for Tony Abbott other than staying in Parliament, and yet obviously he's probably under quite a lot of pressure not to stay in Parliament beyond the election.
That's a damning thing to say, isn't it? That for a former Prime Minister of Australia, that there are so few alternatives.
Well, think about it. Business doesn't these days just pick up people for the sake of it.
No, I believe
like a charity.
I
so he's
don't
not going
need
to
any
do that. I can't see him going into a university. I can see him being on the stage here with us as a political commentator. I must say I can see that.
Yeah.
He could pop up in the Australian anytime.
Hard to see him at the United Nations furthering the cause for women.
I think become a talk show host on the ABC. I can see that happening.
I think yes. I think he could increase the competitive field in the political commentary industry.
All right, we've been warned, ladies and gentlemen. Our time is up, but it's been fascinating. I feel like I'm, in Canberra. It's so terrific. We haven't had very many political journalists this year on the Fit the State, and so it's especially great to have the two of you together to talk about this tonight. Please give Laura Tingle and Michelle Grattan a huge thank you.
Thank you.